Hello and welcome to Modernizing Development and IBM Z using open source software. I'm your host today, Mike Vizard, and there are three things I need you to remember up front. The first is this is an interactive session, so find that little chat button on the side there. If you want to ask a question, fire away. Second thing is there will be polling today. We need you to participate in 2 polls. So watch for those and make sure that you are ready to give us your best insights, as it were. And finally, there are 4 $25 Amazon gift cards that you are eligible for at the end of the session. So everybody's got to hang in there to see who won. Our speakers today are Al Gillen, who's the Group Vice President for Software Development and Open Source at IDC. And we have Peter Fandel, who's Director of Mainframe Open Source and Zoe for Rocket Software. All right, guys, Al, take it from here, and I will see you all in a few minutes.
Great. Thanks, Mike, for the introduction. So thanks, everyone, for joining us today. I'm pleased to be here. And just a little background. So my area of responsibility at IDC is I oversee our application development and deployment research practices. And I also run a program focused on open source software. I've looked at open source software for 20 plus years while at IDC. It's been a fascinating ride watching the industry change over that time period. And we're going to talk today about the relationship between open source software and using IBM Z. And again, we think that that's a really it's indicative of how strong open source software is and how much of a draw and how much of a value it brings to the industry overall. So today there's really 5 areas I want to touch on. I want to start by giving you an overview of where we see open source software today, how broadly it's used, what customers are doing with it, and the reason why it's so pervasive and so important to be looking at how you incorporate open source into your larger infrastructure or your development activities. The second thing I want to touch on is looking at the realities of supporting open source software. And open source, it's long been seen as this panacea because the source code is free, but that doesn't mean it's free to operate and own it over the long term. We'll talk quite a bit about that. And then I want to turn my attention, look specifically at the IBM Z and open source software and the interrelationships there. There's an awful lot to be said there. And then we'll circle back and we'll take a look at what we believe the value proposition is of commercially supported open source software. It's something we've looked at many times over the years at IDC, and frankly, we really see a value associated with commercial support, and we'll explain how that's the case. Finally, I'll leave you with a few bullet points of essential guidance before I turn the presentation over to Peter, who will follow me. So that said, let's just jump right in here. This next couple of slides presents data on open source software adoption on a broad basis across the United States. And one of the things that's not really surprising, I mean, for anybody that's in the industry today, you probably know that open source software is used pretty pervasively across the industry. And the question we ask is, does your organization use any open source software to support workloads or for other purposes? And you can see here that right now 54% of the people are telling us they're currently using it and adding more, and there's another 13% that are currently using it, but there's no change in usage, and there's another 7% that are there's another 7%, that say that they're planning to add open source software. Overall, 77% of organizations are using open source today. So this is, that's 3/4 of organizations overall. So again, it's, chances are pretty good your organization is using open source at this point in time. So for the people that are not using open source software, why would they not use open source software? And these are some of the justifications that people tell us. People typically cite things like intellectual property concerns, or maybe their needs are already pretty well served by other software solutions they're using. And the third item here is that people have concerns about security, which, by the way, is not unusual. Security typically is one of the most important concerns that people cite about just about any software solution, whether it's open source or not. So overall, generally these are questions that people have, but they're not questions that typically are impossible to overcome with open source. In most cases, for example, intellectual property concerns. We used to hear a lot about that, especially, if we go back 20 years ago, we had customers all the time that said, am I going to be sued if I use open source software? And that really has proven not to be the case in the industry overall. So some of these concerns, really have been relieved by the industry pretty well. So in terms of, let's look specifically about open source software in terms of using it in a development scenario. So there's three pie charts I'm going to present here. The first one asks the question of whether you use externally created open source software today as part of your development activities. And that could be using open source development tools. It could be using open source components to integrate into applications you build, things like that. And not surprisingly, it's very pervasive. 76% of the folks that we interviewed said that they do use external open source software in their development activities today. And 20% say they don't use it, and then a little small portion, 4%, are not sure. So in terms of external collaboration, increasingly we see that organizations are looking at open source as not just simply being something that we consume and we use, but rather we give back to the industry. And going forward, we believe that the notion of external collaboration is going to be an area where we're going to see more and more momentum. In fact, when we look at if we look at the Global 2000 today, we find about 60% or 64% of the Global 2000 already have some kind of a developer engagement vehicle, and in many cases they have open source software as one of the things they're using to engage this external community. And we see these organizations increasingly looking to build a community around what they're doing. So in terms of the external collaboration, 65% of the folks are telling us that they're collaborating on external open source software solutions today. So that doesn't really surprise me. In most cases, developers are, they participate in offering some development support for some of the projects that they're most likely to be using or they're most satisfied with. So finally, in terms of sharing open source software, this is something that is very much of interest to people. It's not necessarily happening on a widespread basis today. Less than 1 in 5 organizations today are sharing open source software. However, people see this really as being very important in the future. And as I mentioned, that 64% of the Global 2000 that already have developer outreach. In a number of cases, you'll find that these organizations are already building solutions around open source that they're trying to engage a broader community on. So really, the bottom line is open source is a part of what is going to be central to your development efforts long into the future. So in terms of enabling standardization, one of the things that we've seen as being very important is that the industry has a natural tendency to want to move toward having a more common and a more standard set of deliverable or deployment platforms that we can use. And the value proposition that offers to us is that if you've got the ability to port an application or not necessarily port, but migrate or move an application from one platform to another, that's typically made possible by having standardization across multiple platforms. Open source software has arguably filled a void in the industry that we've had for a long time, where we've had too much incompatibility between platforms. In the 1990s, we saw a lot of effort among the Unix vendors to try to find a way to unify the Unix platform so that you could move from one distribution of Unix to another. But frankly, that was never terribly successful. And at the end of the day, because the Unix industry was unable to come together in the way that customers needed it to, Linux and open source software has gone in and filled that void. So as we look at where the industry is going at this point, we see that open source software offers us the ability to provide not only a modernization of the skills that you're using, but it actually creates this environment where if you're using the same tools across multiple platforms, regardless of what the base infrastructure is and whether it's in public cloud or on premises, it turns out that you get the benefit of having the ability to bring skills into your organization, resources, people, developers and administrators and other resources that are part of your IT platform that would allow you to essentially take people that maybe aren't necessarily familiar with the base platform that you're using, but still be productive on day one. It's about the ability to have skills that are readily transferable. In terms of applications specifically being built, we see applications today that are being built, number one, with increasing levels of abstraction from the underlying hardware, whether that's through containerization or whether it's through having a virtual machine underneath it's like a JVM or some other form of an abstraction layer to insulate the application layer from the underlying hardware, the underlying operating system. And that is really valuable simply because the applications become increasingly portable, which means that they have a longer life cycle. The application can move from platform to platform as you need it to be. And again, you have this ability to support it on multiple platforms with the same resources inside of your organization. And finally, this notion of being able to collaborate with a larger community. So instead of being a one-off application or a one-off language that maybe is not widely used in the industry, you can be using something where there's a broad community of developers that are using the same technologies. There's broad skills, there's broad knowledge, and which means you get the support of that community and the ability to go out to forums and get questions answered and things like that really increase the value of the development experience for your organization. So finally, this notion of collaborating, we do, as I mentioned earlier, we do see the industry increasingly moving to a model where end users, so enterprises like yours, are beginning to look out and say, gee, this particular piece of software we're working with is table stakes. It doesn't create any differentiated value for our particular company. So does this really need to be proprietary on our part? And the answer is probably not. And in many cases, we're seeing industry-wide consortiums. So for example, banking and retail and healthcare and places like that, where organizations are working together to build projects with their community peers using common languages. And that allows the industry overall to move forward. And frankly, the value add that an individual organization can create is typically not done at the infrastructure layer. It's not done at that base layer, but rather it's done at the application experience that your customers get, that your internal users get, and your partners and your distributors and so forth that may interact with you. It's that experience and the quality of that software that can really make a difference to your business. It's not about having better infrastructure layers. So what do customers expect in terms of, what are the values that they expect to get from open source software? And here are some of the things that we think are important for customers to take a look at. So for example, the ability to take advantage of using open source services. And frankly, when you think about it, many of the new things that are being built, whether it's AI and ML, or whether it's IoT services or other things, voice to text, text to voice, things like that. These types of services typically are delivered these days as a microservice or as a containerized service, and the ability to consume those and leverage those as part of your development is a benefit that developers see today. The ability to access technology allowing faster innovation. So this is really about speed to market for customers. That's important as well, and the ability to allow these emerging technologies allow those things or enable those technologies to be available and consumable by our developers. I might note that reducing software costs shows up here, but it's number 4 on the list. And I think it's really interesting to note that this is typically, customers are looking at open source software not primarily as a way of carving costs out of their environment, but rather as a way of empowering their organization to do better things with the tools they have available. And I would have to argue that over the last 12 months or 10 months since we've been in pandemic conditions here in the United States, we've seen a lot of organizations move forward very quickly, and those that were well suited with development tools and the ability to access some of these modern development resources have found that their ability to build new applications to respond quickly to the changed needs of their organization were made possible by open source. And again, this wasn't about cost saving, this was about making sure and empowering the business to continue forward in adverse conditions. So I think I hit on all these things, cost benefits and so forth. So we'll go on to the next slide. This slide takes a look at the expectations of open source software usage during 2019 and projected for 2021. This is data we captured in the tail end of 2019, and this survey actually is about to be refreshed in 2021 right now. But the thing that's interesting here is, if you can notice, just about every category, with the possible exception of DevOps software, the customer said they really expect to see an increase in their consumption of open source in 2021. The 2 different colors here, so you've got the light blue, which shows the 2019 data, and the dark blue, which shows the projection for 2021. So again, this notion that open source software is continuing to impact proprietary software, I mean, that's been a trend we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years, and increasingly becoming pervasive in more and more segments of the industry today. And at this point, there's open source software that's available for virtually every layer of software in the stack that you may be using. So in particular, I'd like to turn our attention to the development tools piece. And again, developers, if you think about developers overall, they typically are, they kind of have a do-it-yourself approach to software, meaning they're perfectly okay using open source software, because if something breaks, they go into the source code, they figure out what the problem is, they fix it, and they keep on going. And that's great for a developer that's working in that kind of an environment. where that starts to become less practical is when the developers build things that go outside of the development environment. And let's face it, every application that developers build are intended to be deployed to the end users. And when you move this stuff outside of the development part of the business, you have to think about what's the supportability of the software, and how supportable is it going to be. These are the kinds of questions you have to ask yourself as you transition an application from development phase into the deployment phase. So it's really, there's this bigger picture that we should be thinking about. And again, typically the developers are thinking about, as they're in that early phase of building the software, but we really need to step back and say, what happens when this application moves into production use? And again, that's something that is increasingly important. The one thing I'd also like to note is that developers are playing a role, an outsized role in the industry today, far greater than they did 5 or 10 years ago, simply because the industry has realized that the differentiation that the business can bring to the table today is increasingly dependent upon software. And the software is written by the developers, and suddenly the developers are being elevated to this new position with frankly with a lot more influence in the organization, simply because they're the ones that can make some of these new innovative practices become real and bring features and capabilities to the business that have never been there before. As we like to say at IDC, drivers are increasingly in the driver's seat today. Okay. Let's see, I want to shift gears. Let's talk a little bit about the realities of supporting open source software. So, as you think about it, all software, whether it's open source or not, it always comes with things like, the need to train your IT staff around how to operate the software, how to install it. There's some cost associated with doing the deployment. There's, of course, a life cycle of the software. You install it, you run it for 5 or 10 years, whatever the life cycle might be. At some point, excuse me, at some point you deactivate the software and you decommission it and that sort of thing. Through that course, you've got maintenance that you have to worry about, and you've got recovery from any issues that may take place and things like that. So this whole life cycle associated with any piece of software, and it's not unique to open source, it's true for all software. So if we think about what are the costs associated with software, we've got an acquisition cost. And frankly, this is one of the ones that we find, and we talk to people about open source, they typically point to this and say, hey, the open source software is free. And while that's true, and you can see a difference between, using free, non-commercially supported open source versus a commercially supported version of open source or proprietary commercial software, yes, there's a price difference there, but typically that cost brings a return for the customers. And we'll talk more about that in a couple of minutes, but let's look at some of the other areas where there are costs associated with installing software. So we've got infrastructure. You've got to put the software on either an in-house server in your data center, or you've got to put it on public cloud or wherever you're going to put the software. So there's costs there. And typically, again, we find that the costs vary based on the kinds of software that we tend to deploy. So there's staff labor costs, right? You've got to train your staff. The staff's got to be able to install the software and be there to support it over the course of the lifetime of the software. And that includes things like vetting the updates and the patches and installing them and responding to any maintenance issues that have to take place and so forth. And then there's the things that we don't really plan for, and that's things like unplanned outages. So when there's downtime, the IT staff has to drop what they're doing and react and respond to this outage and get the system back up. And typically that's a cost item simply because the IT staff has to, they're taken away from whatever other projects they may be working on or should be working on, and have to address the outage and get the systems back up and running. Obviously, we try to avoid unplanned downtime as much as possible in the industry. But there's another thing that happens when we have any downtime, or especially unplanned downtime, is that we've got end users who are potentially impacted as well. So for example, if an application becomes unavailable, how do the users get their job done? Or if you have software which is externally facing, how do your partners interact with your business? How do your customers, your end user customers, actually make purchases or complete transactions like that? These are the sorts of things you have to be thinking about, which is a cost, which is a direct cost to the business if the software is unavailable. So we're going to circle back to this slide in a few minutes, but first let's take a look at IBM and Z in terms of open source software in that world. Okay, so IBM has a long history of being a tremendously positive supporter of open source software. We date really back to 1999 when IBM made its first broad public commitment to open source. IBM has been there to really drive open source across the industry, and certainly, without any doubt, open source software has been a real benefit for IBM. It's allowed it to modernize its platforms and bring new capabilities to a whole host of platforms that really is helpful for IBM to make those platforms still be relevant in the industry. But one of the platforms that, certainly IBM Z platform has benefited benefited quite significantly from open source. In particular, when we think of Z, in many cases, people think of IFLs or the Z Linux platform, which runs Linux natively as an open source platform. And that's true, but that's actually not what we're looking at today. We're considering the IBM Z separately from these other IBM products. And one of the things that's really fascinating is that open source software is continuing to make an impression on that platform as well in very positive ways. So for example, we've got the Open Mainframe project, which is a Linux Foundation initiative that is trying to bring the mainframe forward as a platform that can live in this modern open source ecosystem. And frankly, there's a project called Zoe, which I think, if you're not familiar with it, you should certainly take a look at it. It opens up API access to resources on IBM Z platforms. And if you think about, why would I want to do that? And the answer is probably because most of the transactions that we conduct on the internet at the back end are supported by IBM Z systems. In many cases, whether you're booking airline tickets or you're completing financial acquisitions or transactions, or making banking statements or things like that, very often there's a Z platform involved in the back end of that. And these modern applications that give you the experience you're getting are just front-ending those services that are still running on these systems that have been around for a long period of time. And I might note at the bottom here, so this presentation we're doing today is sponsored by Rocket Software, and Rocket has actually been really active in terms of bringing open source software specifically to the Z platform. So specifically, we've touched on some of these points about IBM. Perhaps most importantly here is that some of the technologies that are coming to the Z platform are allowing the Z platform to operate in a more modern way with modern development languages and using DevOps practices and the tooling that typically organizations are using in a non-Z environment. And it brings it really into the mainstream of development and support at this point in time. So some of the substantial investments that have been made here by IBM and Rocket Software as well is the enablement of the developer ecosystem. So meaning developers can, they can be an expert in developing in a particular language, and if the language is available in the Z, it doesn't really matter if they haven't worked on a Z platform before. They can come and they can use the same language and have the same development and deployment experience. So the application ecosystem really expands because of this. We get this notion of the portability of the skills and the solutions themselves. So the solutions can come onto the Z or can come off of the Z because of the fact you're using languages to build those applications that are commonly used across the industry. And finally, there's a long-term aspect to this, and this is a way of creating not only viability, but the sustainability of the Z platform and the investment that you and customers are making into this platform. So the things you build continue to have relevance and would have extensibility in a broader ecosystem. So again, think of it in terms of you've taken a platform which has just been tremendously valuable over the years to customers, and just simply connecting it to the rest of the world and making it extensible in ways that make it even more valuable going forward. So some of the solutions that are here, and this is just a small example of some of the things that are available for the Z operating system today. So things like PHP and Python as languages, very commonly used in the industry, and frankly, there are skills widely available for these languages. If you're, typically when you think of a Z system, you think of COBOL applications, and certainly there are a lot of COBOL applications that are still out there, but new applications that customers are building typically are not being written in COBOL. They're being written in a more modern language. We've got things like the Java library from the Apache Ant project, and package management and source control management from Conda and Git and so forth. These are all things that make a great deal of sense for developers that are building applications on the Z platform today. So let's take a look specifically at PHP and Python, just to give you for instance, of why having these languages on the Z platform are so valuable for the end customers. So these charts show data from a product that IDC produces called PathView and the Developer. And what this product is it's a deep study around developers. And one of the things that this product delivers is a census and a forecast for developers on a worldwide basis. So we have a lot of different, in fact, we associate the developers with the languages they use typically. And I pulled out the data specifically for PHP and Python, just to give you a for instance. The segments in the stacked bar charts here, so the dark blue are people that are heavily using the language, the light blue is moderate use, and the green is infrequent use of the language. The point I want you to take away from this slide is that if you look at from the developer census, so the number of developers worldwide who are using PHP in 2020 and comparing that to 2024, you can see that the numbers are going up by 42% in terms of the portion of the developers that are either heavily using or moderately using PHP through that period. If you look at Python, the growth is even more significant. The numbers are going up by 67% in terms of the number of developers. And just to put some context around this, there's something in the order of 13 to 15 million developers worldwide. So you can see that, a pretty substantial portion of the developers that are out there have some skills with Python and PHP. So, what does this mean? What's the takeaway from here is that if you're enabling these languages on your Z platform, you suddenly have this really wide opportunity of developer skills. There are developers with skills on these languages that are out in the industry that become candidates to work with you and your organization to support these languages on the Z platform. So I had mentioned earlier that I was going to circle back to the costs. So let's go back to that same chart. But first, I want to just talk about the challenges that we see, and we'll talk about the challenges and the value props associated with open source software. So number one, the challenges, community support may not be available when you need it. So if you're using a community supported technology and you have an outage on a Saturday night, it could be that you might not be able to get any support from the community until Monday or Tuesday. That may be an issue. It's possible that the community might not be able to address the problem at all. And even more so, if the community can address the problem, in many cases, the way open source communities typically work is if there's a problem here and the community says, oh yeah, we see what the problem is, we can fix it, but the community is typically 2 or 3 releases of the software newer, they'll fix the problem in the most current release of the software. And that's great, and that fixes the problem, but it means that you, the end user, are faced with this prospect of how do I get this solution which is created for the current version when I'm 2 versions behind in terms of the version of the software that I'm actually using. So, and then even if you do make that upgrade and refresh the products you have installed, then you've got suddenly potentially regulatory compliance issues to cross, or maybe you have to do testing with other applications. The bottom line is, just having to be able to move from one version of the software to solve a problem to another isn't always the easiest way to get the problem solved. The other problem is that typically the community moves very quickly. There's new releases of software which might be weekly or even on a slower basis if it's monthly. But the point is that these things come out more quickly than most enterprises can embrace and consume these solutions. And finally, the customers themselves need to remain engaged with the community if you're going to be aware of what issues are going on. And again, that's something that's great to do that, but the bottom line is if you're going to be engaged with the community, that takes cycles away from something else you might be doing. So let's take a look at the other side. What's the value prop that supported open source software has? Number one is you can get support when you need it, whether it's 8 hours a day by 5 days a week, or whether it's 24/7. I mean, you can pick the level of support that you need for your particular organization. Typically, we find that commercializers, so companies that take open source software and make them available and then commercially support them, they do things like vetting and hardening of the code. They typically do software composition analysis to make sure that all the components that are pulled in, all the dependencies that are pulled in by the product that you're using actually have correct licensing, that the code is current, that it doesn't have any known vulnerabilities, things like that. And then the steady stream of updates that the community issues, a commercial support provider for you will take that stream of updates and try to work on your behalf to figure out which ones are important, which ones need to be applied, which ones can be applied at a future point in time, and you'll just determine which ones are critical and which ones are not. Some are going to be security issues that you want to address right away. Others might be features or nice to have things that maybe you don't want to disrupt your organization to bring this new change to software in at this moment in time. You wait till you do your next major upgrade 6 months from now. Finally, probably the other most important thing you should think about is in terms of if you want an advocate in the community, typically the commercial vendors provide that advocacy for you. So for example, if you keep running into this thing where a situation where you need a particular feature, or if there's a feature that doesn't really work the way you need it to, that kind of feedback can be fed to the commercial support provider, who in turn works with the community potentially to make the updates or improvements to the software and bring it into the mainstream of the software, which then gets brought into the next release that you'll have access to. So again, it really works on your behalf. Okay, so these are some of the things we talked about earlier, the efficiency of infrastructure and downtime costs. Let's go back and think about what that means in terms of the cost savings that you typically will see when you use commercial support. So this is the same bubble chart I used before, and I'm going to walk you through this. In terms of acquisition costs, as I mentioned earlier, absolutely, the acquisition costs are going to be higher for a commercially supported version of software versus a community supported version. That's a given. We know that's going to be, and that's the one thing, unfortunately, that's the most visible and most tangible aspect of commercially supported open source software. Users look at it and say, well, I can see what here's the purchase order, and I'm spending, X hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to support this particular software when I could actually use the community version for free. That's true. But the problem is that typically that leads to other costs in other areas. So for example, we typically find customers that use commercially supported open source software tend to have lower infrastructure costs. Not necessarily dramatically lower, but what we find is that organizations will stand up more software using commercially supported components than they will using community supported components. The reason why, it's how many eggs you want to put in one basket. And ultimately what that comes down to is if you have more confidence that you can keep this stack of software running on a regular basis and you're not going to have any unplanned outages, you feel comfortable standing up more workloads on the same hardware. So the second thing is your staff labor costs tend to go down because number one, your staff does not have to be an expert in every single open source component that you're using. You can offload that responsibility to the commercial software provider and let your staff focus on the things that they do best, making your bank be a better bank, or making your retailer, if you're a retailer, making your online purchasing more pleasant of an experience, or putting a better delivery chain in place to allow your systems to make sure that product gets placed and delivered to where it needs to be. Again, this is the value to your business, and that's the value that you don't get that value from having a better infrastructure. You get that value from having better applications. The next thing is, if you have supported software, typically your downtime is less in terms of both the frequency and the length of unplanned outages tend to be lower because, again, you've got software which has been vetted by somebody else and they've made sure that they've got the quality of the software is higher and that sort of thing. But also, if there's an outage, you've got somebody to fall back on to help you get systems back up and running, which in turn leads to less time spent not being able to, the end users have less time where they're unable to get their jobs done, which means that they're more effective and more efficient for the business. So ultimately, it's really, what we typically find is the green, the red, and the yellow bubbles tend to be where the real cost savings come in. So the staff labor costs, the downtime costs, and the end users, the impact on the end user all tends to contract. And typically, we find that the costs the cost savings that occur in those three areas far exceed the acquisition costs of the commercial support for open source. Okay, so let's just circle around. I'll give you a few bullet points I'd like you to take away from my part of the presentation today. Number one, as my early slides indicated, the future of software development is really dominated by open source. I mean, open source is here to stay. It continues to become more and more dominant in the industry. And just about every organization that we talk to is either using or looking to use open source at some level going forward. And in many cases, they got plans for pretty heavy use of open source, including building their own open source, building their own projects. So most new software, in the industry, I mean, we see very, very few new software initiatives spun up that are proprietary in nature. Almost everything that we see in terms of new startup companies and new startup projects typically are open source, either in their entirety or at a minimum have an open core component to them. So we don't think that's going to change anytime soon. So we expect that just about everything being created is going to have some tie into open source. The technology is used across platforms. Again, this notion of having skills that are portable from this platform to that platform, and you can have people that don't necessarily have to be an expert in a particular platform, be able to be effective at writing and deploying solutions. That's got real value and long-term benefits for your organization. So as I mentioned in the previous slide with the bubbles, commercially supported open source software generally offers a better value proposition for end user organizations. It's a pretty unusual circumstance when we find an organization that can actually do better using commercially supported open source. I'm sorry, correct myself, using community supported open source. And typically that tends to be a company like Google or AWS, where they've got this massive scale and they have the ability and number of software engineers that they can support this stuff. You have to ask yourself, are you guys is your business akin to the IT infrastructure that Google and AWS has in place, or are you more typical for an enterprise in the industry? In most cases, there aren't too many end user enterprise organizations that can really compete on the scale of a Google or an AWS, and typically it's not necessarily practical for them to support open source themselves. So finally, my last point, buyers are increasingly participating in open source software projects. This is just a fascinating thing for us to watch unfold. And we see this as really a kind of a pivot for the industry overall. And we believe that going forward, we're going to see more and more software projects and applications that are being built by end users that are going to become number one, widely used across the industry, and number two, have broad community support. So watch that space. So with that, I will be taking questions when we get to the end, but first I'm going to turn the presentation over to Peter. He's got some slides to take you through, and then we'll both offer Q&A support. So Peter, over to you.
All right, thank you, Al. Great analysis. So I'm going to now proceed with the second part of this presentation today. So I'm introducing managed open source from Rocket Software. The product name is Rocket Openapt Dev for Z. We'll talk about a little bit about that today. So I'm not going to go into detail on the next couple slides because this is really ground that was well covered by Al in his presentation. But ZOS, known for consistency, availability, and performance, and is still very much used. And if you look at the market, banks, insurance companies, security is of paramount importance, and that's an important part of the app dev for ZOS offering. So I'll be getting into that a little bit more in detail. So to get started, we've got a poll question.
All right, folks, so this is where I warned you about the coming poll. Here we go. Our question is, are you using open source languages and tools in production on your ZOS environment? We'll give everybody a chance to answer. The choices are today, within a year, next year, and don't know. And we'll give everybody 20 seconds or so to think that through, and then we'll come back to everybody with some answers. All right, I think we're good to go. Maybe we can push this poll out and see where we are. All right, we have, don't know, 50%, followed by using it today, 21%, within a year, 16%, and next year, 13%. So I don't know if you guys find that surprising, but I'm going to hand it back to you.
Okay, thank you. Again, the benefits of modernizing in place. So there's really two ways to modernize. If you've got mainframes, you either go off the mainframe and go to another platform for modernization, or you stay in place on the mainframe and modernize there. Obviously, if you're going to be modernizing on the mainframe, based on what Al said, you're going to need open source there. So from survey results, we have found that customers are more satisfied if they modernize in place on the mainframe. And very importantly, they've shown on average higher annual revenue growth and better savings if they modernize in place. As far as the reasons for modernizing and the benefits of, again, that was well covered by Al, so I'll very quickly hit the high points there. In terms of staffing, it's becoming increasingly difficult to acquire new development engineering staff for the mainframe that are comfortable and productive using the traditional tool sets. So basically, if you want to staff up more application development on the mainframe, you really have to have open source, because those are the tools and languages that the next generation of developers expect to use. Also, there's an important cost savings in terms of standardization, and that's where all the latest technology is going, is in open source. So if you want the latest tooling, you've got to have open source. Another poll question.
All right, folks, here we go with our second poll. Are you all ready? What are the obstacles preventing the increasing use of ZOS open source within your organization? Please select one. Risk about how well the package will be maintained. Concern over licensing and compliance. Identifying remediating security vulnerabilities. Difficulty hiring skilled employees. Lack of open source culture in the organization. All right, we'll give everybody 20 seconds to think that through, because it may be difficult to just pick one, but please do. All right, I think we should be just about there, and let's see if we can push this out. Okay, our top answer is concerns over licensing and compliance at 31%, followed by lack of open source culture in the organization at 22%. Identifying and remediating security vulnerabilities came in at 19%, in a tie with risk about how well the package will be maintained. And the least concern is difficulty hiring skilled employees. Folks, we're going to give this back to you, and thank you all for participating in our polls.
All right, thank you. Well, that's a good confirmation that it's in line with what we've seen in terms of the concerns and consideration with adopting open source. So these are, from what we've seen, user experience, basically making it really easy to download, install, consume, maintain, update open source on ZOS has been a major concern. That's the ongoing maintenance. Security is a huge concern, making sure that the developers in your organization are going to someplace safe to get open source where you know the provenance of that open source, as well as version latency, which is also really security concerned in that you want the latest versions that have the latest fixes to the most recent security vulnerabilities that have been discovered for various applications. And finally, having expert support to give you somebody to call in the middle of the night when you need help. That's obviously a major concern if you're going to be putting open source into the critical path of your organization. So this is what brought us to develop Rocket Openapt for Z to address these concerns. First and foremost, it's important to know that Rocket Openapt for Z is more than code. Yes, it has 20 plus open source languages and tools like PHP, Python, Bash, Git, curl, and I'll show you the full list in a moment. But very importantly, it is based on new technology that is behind the scenes that Rocket has developed. Rocket has developed GCC and glibc ports that we use internally to automate the generation of ports. What this enables us to do is we can now generate through this GCC compile executables of Bash and other open source ports without making a single line of source code change. So without making source code changes, we can generate open source binaries for ZOS. It's a game changer for us because the individual communities that develop these open source toolings, typically they're not interested in porting to ZOS. For them, it's not a well-known platform. And the cost is high because they have to get access to a mainframe system, and there's literally dozens and dozens of these communities out there. So we found this is the best and only way to provide rapid security updates. Another aspect that is unique to Rocket Openapt for Z is our adoption of Conda for secure delivery and deployment. Conda is a fantastic technology, ideally suited to the mainframe. I'll get into the details of that in a moment, but it makes for a very easy user experience of owning open source on ZOS, or rather using it. And finally, Rocket's world-class support. Again, you need somebody to call when you need help if you're relying on open source. So again, it's more than code. It's about security, compliance, and support. So this is the full list of what we have today in Rocket Openapt for Z. For the developer, we have languages and development tools, PHP, Python, Vim, Git, curl, Apache Ant, Make. For the operator, we have the package management dependency tool, Conda. We have a portfolio of compression, decompression tools, Bash, Z, which make temp. And in the area of security, OpenSSL, libssh2, and sudo. And more will be added over time. If there's a new port that we add that is part of the AppDev DevOps domain space, we'll just add it in, and you don't have to pay extra to get that when it becomes available. So this is a little bit more detail about our delivery system based again on Conda. Conda has this concept called channels, which are repositories of source code from which you download what you need. And Conda supports 3 different kinds of channels. There's the public channel, which is hosted usually on a public site, no password needed. And there's dozens and dozens of sites out there where you can download from public channels. And Rocket has provided a curated public channel with our ports in it. But if you want secure access where it's password protected and you want the latest updates, you would go to the middle or the right side here. You get access to these channel options with Rocket AppDev, Openapt Dev for Z. The latest security vulnerability fixes are available on our private internet channel. And on your own file channel if you want to set one up. So the file channel option is perfect if you have an air-gapped mainframe, that means not connected to the internet. That enables your developers to download whatever open source they need from an internal source. So it's extremely secure. This is the workflow using Conda. This is a huge increase in usability from what we had previously a couple of years ago at Rocket. To install Git would be about 40 steps because there's 4 prerequisites for Git. So you would have to download and install each one of the prerequisites. Each one was about 10 steps. Today with Conda, it's a single command line to both download and install Git and all of its dependencies. And Conda takes care of making sure the correct version of each dependency is installed for whatever version of Git you're installing. So it's a really big advancement in ease of use and ownership experience. On the left side is if you're using Rocket's secure channel. So it's just that one command line. On the right side, if you're setting up an on-premise file channel, there is an additional step that your administrator would need to do to download the bundle, set up your on-premise channel, populate it with the contents. But once that's done, your developers in your organization can download what they need from that channel, again, with a single command. So Rocket's world-class support is the gold standard of support. We have a 96% customer satisfaction rating. We have very experienced support professionals, both level 3 and level 2. And in the case of Rocket Openapt Dev for Z, we have level 3 developers that are providing support in 3 different time zones. So we really do have 24/7 support, even at the level 3 level for Rocket Openapt Dev for Z. So in summary, going back to the concerns for adopting open source on ZOS, in terms of user experience and security, Conda is an important part of our solution to address these concerns. Conda really does a fantastic job of combining a great user experience with high security. In terms of version latency and getting the latest versions of what you need fast so that you're not vulnerable to any security errors or bugs, the GCC automated porting technology is a key part of our offering, and only Rocket has this. And then finally, Rocket's 24/7 support will give you the assurance that you can use our open source ports in security. We'll be there for you if you have problems. So in terms of getting help, The Rocket Forum is another really important part. In addition to our 24/7 support, the forum enables the community of users of our ports to ZOS to talk to each other, help each other. We post educational sample videos there. This is actually available for the entire community, whether or not you're paying support. Anybody who downloads our open source ports can access the forum, and I highly recommend visiting that and checking out the community. So in terms of next steps, I recommend you read the IDC report. It's a really good analysis, and read the IDC Tech Spotlight. The links are there in this presentation, which you'll have access to. Thank you very much. So at this point, we open the field to questions.
All right, good to be back. That was an awesome presentation, guys, and we do have a couple of questions. I'm going to remind everybody else to find that question tab and contribute whatever you feel is pressing on your mind. But the first question is going to go to Peter. And how long does it take to install Conda? I mean, how big an effort is that? It's a managed service, so who's doing the heavy lifting?
No, I'm glad you asked that, because it is kind of a bootstrapping step that everybody has to do if you want to use our ports. Is yes, once you install Conda on your ZOS system, it's a single command line to install whatever you want, but you do have to set that up. It takes about 10 minutes to install and configure if you've done it before and you know exactly what you're doing. First time, reading the instructions line by line, it might take you 20, 25 minutes.
All right, and I'm going to ask a follow-up on that because I would be remiss given the platform that we're on. But Peter, are you seeing folks starting to adopt DevOps on mainframes environments as open source comes through? And are these things coming together in a hand in glove kind of fashion?
Yeah, we saw actually a doubling of downloads after the introduction of Rocket Openapt for Z. There's been a lot of activity. Rocket uses this portfolio ourselves for developing, for building and testing our own mainframe products that we sell through Rocket Direct and also through IBM. And we are seeing already people deploy these tools out there in the customer space as well.
All right, our next question is going over to Al. Al, Peter talked about this, but are you actually seeing modernization work on the Z platform itself? Because there's a couple of ways to run Linux on a mainframe, but are people running that side by side with ZOS, and what are some of the nuances of that?
Yeah, actually, it's a fairly involved question. So let me kind of parse it out. First of all, Linux, Linux is a solution which is available on the Z, but when we're talking about ZOS, you wouldn't necessarily be using Linux in a ZOS environment. So yes, there's modernization happening in terms of people adding new workloads over on the Linux side, whether it's on a Linux One or an IFL or however you want to support Linux. On the Z platform itself, under ZOS, we're seeing modernization there as well. In fact, when we ask customers, typically customers say, they're aggressively moving toward modernizing their applications. And granted, this is typically a multi-step process. In other words, you don't simply take an application and just, replace it with essentially rewrite it from scratch. What we typically see happening is customers look at this and they say, I'm going to take this little piece of the application, move it off of the current, the current language that it's in, and rewrite it as a microservice or write it in a new language and extend the functionality. Or maybe it involves tapping the resources that are already in an existing application and making them accessible to external applications. The bottom line is that we do see modernization taking place across all the industry, and the intent and the expectation to modernize is very broad.
Can I elaborate on one aspect of that I think I failed to focus on during my presentation? Is to stress that what we are talking about here is porting to ZOS, not porting to the mainframe, because porting to the mainframe of open source could mean Linux on Z or running in a ZCX Docker container. The problem with that, I mean, that's perfectly fine and good for certain applications, but all of the valuable business data on the mainframe is on ZOS. And if you're running open source on Linux on Z, yes, it's hosted by the same hardware, but it's on a different machine, and you need to go over TCP/IP to get at that data, to get at that source code. So it's an important distinction. If you really want to be close to the data, close to the source code for your builds, you need to have open source on z/OS, not in a Docker container, not on Linux on Z.
And let's just follow up on that while we're on it. Part of that issue is the latency involved in the applications, right? Because
Absolutely.
if I do have this open source code and wants to integrate with z/OS for some sort of digital business transformation thing, it's got to hum, right?
Absolutely, right. That's a major factor.
All right, great. Let's come back to Al here for a minute. You were talking about PHP and Python being used to build applications, and I think that's largely in the realm of AI. Are people using other languages to modernize, and what are you seeing, and are they using that to build AI?
Yeah, Mike, so I mean, there's such a focus on building new applications today to empower businesses and to bring new features and functionalities to both their products and to their services, that we see a lot of investment going on. And the developer population is growing rather aggressively right now, and partly in response to these needs. And we're seeing an increase in virtually all the modern languages that are in use. You know, believe it or not, we still see, you know, consistent usage of things like RPG and COBOL, and the reason for that is that there's these applications that are out here. But what we typically see is we see a shift. If you remember my chart where I showed the heavy usage, moderate usage, and occasional usage, we see more of a shift from that, you know, heavy to moderate to occasional, or even to the no usage segment, which would be beyond that for some of these languages that are aging. And the language, again, things like you know, certainly you know, as I mentioned, PHP and Python certainly are there. We see, you know, C# and Java and JavaScript all being things that are growing very, very aggressively right now.
Okay. And our next question could be really long answers, so let's try to keep it short. But in the report, is there any kind of examples of the actual savings that you would get if you use commercial support for open source? Al, did you know, how much detail did you get into?
Yeah, the report does. It's not a return on investment study, so it doesn't actually break down exact numbers in terms of costs. But let me just step back and say, you know, we've done a lot of studies over the years looking at open source software compared to either proprietary or to community-based software. And thinking specifically about the comparison to community software, typically we find that the cost of the commercial subscriptions to support the open source software that you're using, generally speaking, that cost that you incur in subscribing is less than the savings you'll see over the course of a year. So typically that investment is always paid back in the same year. So you know, there generally is a pretty good return on that. And by the way, it's not just simply a financial discussion. Again, think back to the fact that, you know, what's associated with the financial savings is also the value that comes out of it. You've got better performance and you've got better uptime in your systems, and that's got a lot of value that's not necessarily measured directly in dollars.
All right, guys. Hey, thanks for spending some time with us. I need to get to the winners of the Amazon cards. That is Steve S., David M., Joel F., Debbie M. Congratulations to all our winners. I want to thank Al and Peter for sharing their knowledge and expertise today. That was awesome.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
And thank you all for spending some time with us, and best of luck in your future mainframe adventures.
All right.